a 10 minutes break.
The Summeracademy and Hildegunde and everybody. My name is Tony Evanko. I'm the director of the Casa Tres Patios in Medellin, Colombia. And I want to focus today really on the first part of the talk is going to be about the context actually in Medellin and a little bit about the history. It's taken us 10 years basically to realize that we as an arts organization need to look at the context and understand our context in order to really be able to make an impact both in the artistic community and in the community in general. And what we've learned is that to a great extent we need to understand the pre-existing and historical and social and cultural dynamics that exist in the city as well. And in order to do that, it's important to look at the issues that form the history of the country. So when people think of Medellin, Colombia, what do they think about? They think about Pablo Escobar, drug trafficking, and the revolutionary guerrilla groups. But, and it's true that those subjects are included in the history and therefore in the context. But really to more deeply understand the specific context, it's important to briefly consider other aspects of the history of Colombia. Colombia is a formerly colonized country. It's also a country that has experienced violence during most of the period since becoming an independent nation. Before, during, and after the revolution, a class distinction has been maintained that affects the ways that people relate to one another, how they relate to the power structures in general, and how the state and the upper class considers and treats the rest of society, and how the rest of society considers itself. In Colombia, as in other countries, the middle and lower strata of society were always considered as the working class, and the education system has been set up accordingly to educate the people to be able to accomplish the basic functions that they were expected to accomplish in the industrialization of the country or in the area in which they lived. The educational system consciously discouraged thinking beyond ideas prescribed by the church and the state. And this creates a system in which the disenfranchised, non-aristocratic class receive an education to produce workers, but not citizens, and also creates expectations in members of the same class regarding the value of education and the ways that they perceive their relationships to society. Since Spanish ruled Colombia, political dissent has not been well received and was frequently dealt with through intimidation and murder. Assassinations and kidnappings of political dissidents, union leaders, and journalists was common and still continues in some areas. The revolutionary movements of the 1960s continue today, and the international drug trade that began at the same time also continues and is now controlled by diverse factions, including the guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, and a wide network of large and small criminal gangs. Human trafficking has also entered into the equation, and corruption and political involvement in these activities is also common. As occurs in many places in the world, the criminal organizations also use intimidation and violence to control criticism and resistance to the people and the authorities. The history of violence in and around Medellin also continues with the illegal seizure of land, and this has created a community comprised of displaced persons in which many of the people are only a couple of generations removed from rural living with its corresponding conservative value systems. And I have to say, in order to emphasize that, in Medellin, Colombia suffered a period which is called La Violencia in the 1950s and 60s, and that created a situation in which many of the people migrated from the countryside to the city. In Medellin in 1961, there were 600,000 people, and when I arrived the first time in 2001, 40 years later, there were 3 million people in the valley. So you can see that the influx of people from the countryside created an enormous dynamic in the city of basically people that came from the countryside with their value systems, and these are the people that inhabited the city and now were students in the art departments, which didn't exist at the time. They only started to have art departments in the university maybe 20 years ago. So anyway, what are the effects of living in a country or a city like this, in which the scars of colonization are still present, or in which criticism is discouraged, and corruption, violence, intimidation, retribution, and criminality have become the norm? It becomes a society in which the sense of intimidation in which intimidation, the sense of impotence, and lack of criticism exist. And Criticism, and the word criticism is actually very seldomly used in Medellin. When it's used, it's considered to be not a constructive exercise, but it's always taken as a personal or political attack. And these factors and the fact that Medellin, for much of its history, was geographically isolated, have created a unique type of citizen that's family-oriented, fiercely independent, practical, competitive, proud of almost everything local, extremely entrepreneurial, hardworking, and friendly to visitors, as well as being conservative, fearful, mistrustful, ethnocentric, and reluctant to give or accept criticism. And as we learned about the history of the city and the country, we began to understand why there is little or no art criticism in the newspapers, and why students are reluctant to make comments about their fellow students' work, or to ask questions in lectures when visiting artists or curators present their work. It goes beyond the typical fear of appearing ignorant. They are simply not accustomed to having questions well received, or to be openly questioning their peers, or the authority or knowledge or experience of a professor or an invited artist. This also applies to the children and the young people who participate in our socially oriented programs. They're just used to being told what to do. They're not used to openly expressing their own thoughts or opinions. So what does one do under those circumstances? How can topics like criticism in art or critical thinking be presented? How can we help art students and artists to establish criteria for evaluating their work in order to compete in the global art market? How can we encourage art students to give and receive constructive criticism to each other and to engage in debates with their professors? Finally, how can we empower children and young people so that they understand that they can make a significant change in their surroundings or in their city? In order to address these issues, a little over 5 years ago, we realized that essentially we were interested in the pedagogical power of art and art practices to generate change. We started to consolidate our ideas about exactly how we should integrate pedagogy into our programs. And we defined 3 main areas of interest: pedagogy, research, and practice. And we call our pedagogical program the Institute for the Development of Uncertainty, or the IDU. While we already had frequent lectures and workshops by resident artists and others, we began to more consciously integrate our artist residency into the other programs. We began to establish topics that interested us and to use them as criteria for our calls or invitations for artists and other collaborators. And we're finally at the point of being able to integrate the artist residencies and curating and research into the IDU. Within the IDU, we have 7 projects that are either permanent or that we do according to the need and the demand. These projects are called Kuboekis, the Creative Communal Laboratories, Laboratories for Unlearning, from the idea to the project, itinerant workshops, the Internship Center, and open source territories. Today I'm going to try to talk about 2 of those projects. One is Kuboekis, which is directly related to our experiences in the art departments of the different universities in Medellin. And the other one is the Creative Communal Laboratories, which are directed toward children and adolescents and focuses more on the development of the person and interpersonal skills rather than teaching any sort of technical skills. Kuboekis was conceived of to benefit local artists and art students in the local community. First, we wanted to create a space for local artists in which they would be able to have the opportunity to do experiments, to work on ideas that they had not had the opportunity to work on before, and to look at aspects of their practice from a different point of view. During the month-long residency, we encouraged the artists to experiment and to take risks, to focus on process and not on the final products. For the art students, we offered an elective class in association with one of the universities in which the students were responsible for researching the artists that would be in Kuboekis, to actively participate in the public presentations, to attend classes every other week in which the artist process would be discussed, and then to produce a short critical essay about the practices and the process that they witnessed. We also set up a parallel project in which a small group of adolescents interested in the audiovisual techniques would record the artist processes, conduct interviews with the artists, and produce short videos using these materials. The process of the young people is monitored, and the young people are mentored by a person with several years of experience in the production of audiovisual projects. And during this process, in addition to learning audiovisual techniques, the participants have direct contact with the artist. They become familiar with the diverse range of artistic practices and expand their knowledge of what it means to be an artist. The public is also invited to witness the artist process. It becomes, it's sort of a space in which we try to demystify what it means to be an artist in this community. And the artist, as a result, must commit to being in the space for 16 hours a week. They must interact with anyone who wishes to talk to them, and they must give some sort of a presentation about their work or that they're doing in the space 3 points during the residency. The question is, why do we think that it's important for artists to work in this way and to have this experience? And we find that in Medellin, the artists frequently fall in love with their first ideas, and they often get stuck in this particular form of production. And we know that that's not unusual, that occurs in many places, but we think that there are many reasons for this. One is that the university and the art market places emphasis typically on final products, or the artwork, and it seems to stifle the artist's motivation for doing research or for seeking alternative forms and developing their ideas. And this means that the artists and art students don't develop a deeper understanding of the issues that they are working on. And second, they don't use any sort of iterative process or exploratory process to refine the criteria for determining if one technical direction is better than another. They go directly into the production with little critical thinking about their work, and they seek and receive little critical feedback about their working process. In Kuboekis, the artists are encouraged to spend time researching and experimenting. And generally, the artists who interact more with the public, or who experiment more, or who have taken more risks in their experiments, say that the experience made a greater impact in their process. Many have continued to work on in the same directions that they started on when they were working during the Kuboekis experience. And the project has also generated interesting results from the students who participated in the elective class that we offered through the university. Some of the first artists to participate in the program were actually the professors of these students, or professional artists who also teach in the university. And the experience actually served to reverse the roles between the professor and the students. The students were able to see that even the professors or the experienced artists produce questionable work, especially in the initial stages. And the students were given permission to question the professors and about their subjects, the techniques used in their explorations, and where they might be going with their explorations. This is an experience diametrically opposed to the experience that they typically have in the university. The public also has a chance to question the artists about their ideas and their processes. And since the work is not finished and the artist acknowledges that the work is not finished, the people in the audience feel more free to express their opinions and to ask questions and to make suggestions. So all 3 groups that we initially targeted benefit from the process that occur in Kuboekis. The second project in the IDU that I want to talk about was begun in 2012 in association with the Secretary of Culture in Medellin. This experience has stimulated and enabled us to develop our own hybrid pedagogical methodology called Laboratorios Comunes de Creación, or creative communal laboratories. We spent the last 4.5 years developing a methodology that permits us to empower the participants to realize projects that stem from their own experiences and interests, while also enabling us to focus on important topics such as human rights and citizenship, and the participants' relationships to these concepts. This is a citywide project that annually reaches approximately 800 children and adolescents between the ages of 8 and 18 from all income levels, and we have 30 sites all over the city in which we conduct these laboratories. We began the project at the request of the Secretary of Culture as an experiment to convert the project, which began in 2008, from technique-based art classes to laboratories, in which ideas about interpersonal relationships between the participants and their families, their neighborhood, and the city can all be explored. We began by looking at aspects of the pedagogy of the oppressed by Paulo Freire, project-based learning, teaching as a subversive activity, the Reggio Emilia method, Anna May Barbosa's triangular proposal, John Dewey's concepts, spiral learning, and others. And in this project, we use the exploration of materials, creativity, and games to break down some of the initial cultural and social barriers that were mentioned earlier. We create situations in which the participants look at the differences between themselves, and we encourage them to look at their surroundings and the city. And finally, we encourage them to consider opportunities for change that they might wish to address via longer-term projects. In order to indirectly we can go into more about the project, but I just want to say that part of the difficulty that we have with this project is, with the children, it's easy. They have their attention, their energy, it's very easy, but with the art students, it's difficult actually to get them to come into the project because of this, this resistance to anything outside of their own realm. There's a huge ethnocentric movement, and it makes it very difficult for us to make an impact in the artistic community. Thank you.